So, welcome to Beauty of Colors podcast, Terry. It's great to have you on the show.
Leanne, thanks for having me on. I'm really looking forward to talking with you today.
You're very welcome. So, Terry, tell us a little bit about you and what is your story?
Yeah, I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I am the oldest of three boys. You can't tell this from looking at me or from my voice, but I'm 6'8" tall and actually went to college at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina on a basketball scholarship. After college, I moved home to find a job. I'm really going to date myself now. This was long before the internet was available to help people find employment. I did find that first job in the corporate headquarters of Wendy's International, the hamburger chain, in their marketing department. That was the good news. The bad news was I lived with my parents for the next 3.5 years as I helped my mother care for my father and my grandmother, who were both dying of different forms of cancer. Professionally, as I said, started out at Wendy's, and then I went to work for the hospital that cared for my father and my grandmother. Then I made a major pivot in my life and became a police officer. And part of what I did during my law enforcement career was I was a SWAT hostage negotiator. After that, I started a school security consulting business, coached girls high school basketball. But for the last 12 years now, I've been battling a rare form of cancer, a rare form of melanoma. And then finally, my wife and I have been married for 30 years. We have one child, a daughter, who's a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy and is an officer in the new branch of the military, the Space Force.
Wow, that's a lot of accomplishments.
That just means I'm old. So, it just.
So, Terry, how can one use knowledge to develop their wisdom?
Yeah, I think those things are two entirely opposite things. I think you can be wise and you can use other people's, I think you can be knowledgeable and use other people's knowledge, but I don't necessarily think you can be wise and use other people's wisdom. I think wisdom is something that comes from the experiences that you have in your life, the good times, the bad times, and what you learn from those times. And I think that's an incredibly important point, is that we all have good and bad times in our life, but do we learn from them? Do we take the lessons that are supposed to be taught to us and apply them to our lives going forward? I don't think a lot of people necessarily do that. There's a lot of really smart people that are not really very wise, not very knowledgeable of the world that they live in. And I think there's also a lot of people that aren't very educated that are incredibly wise based on what they've learned from their experiences in life.
So you're saying, Terry, that you don't have to have knowledge in order to have wisdom. So it's two different things.
I think they are. Yeah, I think they're absolutely two different things.
So and you said experience so somebody who is older, would you say, would have more wisdom than a younger person?
I think potentially. I think it also depends on the experiences in life. I mean, if somebody who's older who hasn't experienced a lot of ups and downs versus somebody who's younger who has experienced a lot of trials and tribulations in their life, that younger person may have more wisdom than the older person based on the experiences that they've had in their life.
Okay. So you've written a book. What is your book about? Does it talk about that? Or is your book, is it a memoir? Tell us a little bit about your book and why you decide to write the book and who is the book for?
Yeah, I never wanted to write a book. It wasn't something that I set out to do. There's kind of an old joke that goes, when we talk to God, it's called prayer. When God talks to us, it's called schizophrenia. So God never told me to write a book. But I think what God did was put enough people in my path that said, hey, you should write a book. You should write a book. And I think I'm smart enough to kind of look at that and say, well, maybe I ought to pay attention to that. So the book is called Sustainable Excellence, 10 Principles to Leading Your Uncommon and Extraordinary Life. And it's a book that was really born out of two conversations that I had. One was with a former player that I had coached when I coached high school basketball, who'd moved to the area in Colorado with her fiance, where my wife and I live. And the four of us had dinner one night. And I remember saying to her after dinner that I was excited that she was living close and I could watch her find and live her purpose. And Cleanne, got real quiet for a while. And then she looked at me and she said, well, coach, what do you think my purpose is? And I said, I have absolutely no idea what your purpose is, but that's what your life should be about. Finding the reason you were put on the face of this earth, using your unique gifts and talents, and living that reason. So that was one conversation. And then I had a young man reach out to me on social media and ask me what I thought were the most important things he should learn, not to just be successful in his job or in business, but to be successful in life. And I didn't want to give him the, get up early, work hard, help others. I didn't want to give him sort of the cliches that we all know. I wanted to see if I could go deeper. So eventually I kind of had these 10 thoughts, these 10 ideas, these 10 principles. And so I sent them to him. And then I stepped back and I was like, well, I got a life story that fits underneath that principle, or I know somebody whose life emulates this principle. So as part of my cancer journey, I had my leg amputated in 2020. And while I was healing from that amputation, I sat down at the computer every day and I built stories, and they're real stories about real people underneath each of the principles. And that's how sustainable excellence came to be.
So your book is for everybody who's going through adversity and everybody who is actually going through cancer surviving. Do you mention that in the book or no?
Somewhat. I mean, it's not necessarily a memoir. I mean, there are stories that I've experienced in my life, but there are also stories about adversity, overcoming adversity, what other people have experienced in life. So it's really about overcoming adversity in your life and being able to be successful. And I'm writing another book now that also is about another word that begins with S, and that's significance. Success is what we do for ourselves, how we can be successful. Significance is how we can help other people, how we can be significant in other people's lives. Don't get me wrong. I think you can be both. I think you can be successful and significant, but I really wanted to write that second book that really was about more helping other people as opposed to how I can use this to be successful in my life.
So is this book, is it going to be a sequel to the first one, or is it a different topic?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a different topic. It's going to be still story based. I think we learn better through stories. I once heard a quote that said, never make a point without telling a story, and never tell a story without making a point. And I love that. If I told you something, you might remember it. But if I told you something and then told you a story behind it, there's a greater chance that you might remember what I said.
Okay. So when is the book? Is it going to be out pretty soon, or you're not too sure when it's going to
So
be?
I've got a first draft done. I am on the second draft now, kind of cleaning it up and sort of pulling the different stories together in that. I'm hoping to have it out by the end of the year. I'm under no time frame. I don't have a publisher breathing down my neck or anything like that. So it'll come out when I feel it's the best that it can be. I always want to make sure that whatever I do, I try to make it as good or make it the best that I possibly can.
So how do you find potential in other people?
I think we're all full of potential. And I think I think you have to ask the right questions. And sometimes I don't think people, let me say it this way. I think small minds prevent people from ever thinking in their life what it means to be great. I read somewhere that 98% of people die without ever realizing their dream. And if you think about that, I'll just go back to books. There was a survey done, 83% of Americans felt that they had a book inside them, either a memoir or a self-help book or a novel or something like that. And yet less than 1% of those people will ever write that book, will ever actually put that book on paper so that others can read it. We all have a story. And that story is important. That story is significant. That story can teach other people a lesson. So I think we are all untapped potential. And it's just a matter of getting people to find out what they're good at and using that for their own success, using that to make other people's lives better, using that for making their community better and things like that. So I think it's just a matter of asking the right questions and getting us to pull out what we're good at for the betterment of ourselves and for others.
So, Terry, where can the listeners get in touch with you? Where can they get a copy of your book? And do you have any speaking engagements coming up? Do you have any resources on your website where you can refer the listeners to?
Yeah, so Sustainable Excellence is available anywhere you can get a book online. So Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, Apple iBooks, it's available there. I have a blog called, I almost told you what my blog was called. It was the title of my book. Sorry. The blog is called Motivational Check. There is information on there on how to get in touch with me, my social media accounts, how to book me as a speaker, how to get access to my book. I also have recommendations for other books to read, other videos to watch that might help other people. And that's all at motivationalcheck.com.
So you do have a blog, you said. How often do you write on your blog?
Every day. Every day I put up a thought for the day. And with that thought usually comes a question about how maybe you could apply that in your life. On Mondays, I put up the Monday morning motivational message, which is usually a longer writing. And then on Tuesdays, I do what I call a Sustainable Excellence Extras, which is something kind of out of the book that I wrote that might apply to people's lives. Then the rest of the week is dedicated to the different podcasts where I guest on.
So, Terry, do you have any last words for the listeners about what they can do to help others better their lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that I did in my life, as I mentioned, is I was a SWAT hostage negotiator. And we learned a lot about communicating with other people, not just as police officers or negotiators, but how we all communicate with each other. And I'll just give you a couple of tips that we were taught. One of the things, we were given a formula when we first started, and that formula was 738-55. And it had to do with how we communicate a message to each other. 7% are the words that we use. And think how many times you say something, you're like, oh, did I say the right thing? Or maybe I shouldn't have said that. That's only 7% of how you communicate a message. 38% is the tone of voice that you use with those words. And then 55%, so more than half of how we communicate a message, is our body language and our facial expressions. And so understanding that, when we were negotiating with people, these were people who very well may have been barricaded in rooms, had guns and stuff like that. We were not in the room with that person. We were on the phone, sometimes blocks away. So we didn't have that 55%. We didn't have the luxury of saying something to somebody and seeing them kind of roll their eyes and be like, oh, I can't believe he asked that question to me. So we didn't have that luxury. The way we figured things out was two ways. One, we used what was called tactical empathy. You can get rid of the word tactical and just talk about empathy. In other words, help me to understand where you're coming from. Not necessarily agree with you, but help me to understand. Because if I can understand, understanding builds trust, and trust gets you to a point where you can change behavior. And the way we did that is we asked how and what questions. So we would stay away from why questions. Be like, well, Cleanne, why did you do that? Oh, wait a minute. That sounds accusatory. That sounds like maybe I said you shouldn't do that. I can get to the same information by saying, well, Cleanne, what got us to this point? That's a much softer question that gets me the same information. So I guess a long-winded answer to your question is, try to understand other people. Try to understand where they're coming from. We all have our own perspective based on our education, our background, the experiences we had in our life. But try to put yourself in that other person's shoes. Try to see life from their perception. What are they thinking? What are they doing? And if you can do that, it's amazing how much you can communicate with each other.
Wow. Nicely said, Terry. Well, Terry, thank you for being on Beauty of Colors podcast.
Well, Cleanne, thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed talking with you.